everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape-man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person, to outburn the gods.
Hello everyone and welcome to yet another episode. It's a pleasure to be here as always, and I can see we've already got a few members in chat. We're lovely to have you here. Crimson Clad, Patient Zero, Rondon, Revised Sociology, and Alien Honey. A pleasure as always. Oh, is that my image? No, that's that image. Okay, I think my sound might be a little too loud. I think it's clipping, so I'm turning it down a little bit. Hopefully it's okay, let me know. And for now, we can get started. So this week's subject, let's say, we're continuing with the same format. We've got a few more things to cover. And this week we're going to be talking about the brain, the brain's anatomy and how it works. Obviously, as always, this is a huge subject that we will attempt to cover in an hour. But we're going to go through a few sort of basic concepts and basic anatomy for those who know absolutely nothing. And then we will see as it correlates more and more to the subject that we've been talking about so far. So let's get into it. Hope you enjoy. So the first thing I actually wanted to mention was we've spoken a few times by now about form versus function, and form and function, and how certain things have a form that decides and some things have a function that decides. And let's just give a very quick example in case you haven't heard the other episodes. If we think of a cup is very much decided by the form. So the form decides the function. Because it's shaped like a cup, it can be used as a cup. Whereas, for example, if we think of a book, a book's form is not really its function. That's why you can have an e-book, an electronic book, which really is sort of a screen displaying, digital information. But as long as you can see the words, or an audio book, as long as you can hear the words, we still define it as a book because the book's function is not necessarily tied into its form. And we have sort of very powerful cases in nature of the form and function being absolutely one and the same, that they cannot be separated. And so with our example, the brain is a very clear manifestation of this thinking. The actual brain, the function of the brain, the memories, the thoughts, the feelings, etc., are all decided by and governed by the actual physical, biological form of the brain. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, but when the brain cells, which are actually called neurons, are physically growing, and it's their physical growth and being that actually decides how the brain works, etc. So it's another example of what we were speaking about, where you have this more less abstract level where things have a form and function that are one and the same, or two sides of the same coin. Now, the science of brains and brain anatomy, etc., is called neuroscience, and it's a subject that I have personally been very, very interested in, well, for quite some time. I think I started getting into it more and more in my early 20s, and spent quite a long deal of time for someone who is an amateur and had nothing to gain from studying it, but it was fascinating, and I also felt it was very important for the subjects that I wanted to study and wanted to invest my time in. Oh, thank you so much, Crimson Clad. So I was very interested in neuroscience, and I studied, read books and heard lectures, etc. And the one thing that we really need to understand at the get-go is that neuroscience is not an exact science. And in fact, the history of neuroscience is a very interesting one for those who have never read anything about it. The early discoveries and also the, shall we call them misguided theories, are quite interesting to see, basically. So for those who have no idea what I'm talking about, there was a quite a common theory called phrenology, PH, and this was the study of the different parts of the brain physically in size, deciding basically what they were in charge of, and their relative position was an indication of their function. And this is not the case today, and we've pretty convincingly disproved that theory. But there have been many different theories of trying to understand how the brain works. And one of the theories that we've covered in this podcast was indeed the theory of the human antenna versus the consciousness generator, as it were, where whether the brain itself creates consciousness and creates what we know to be sort of the mind and the psyche, or rather it is more tuned into something like a radio station and picks up consciousness as a quote-unquote wave. So this is again a discussion that is pertinent to the brain's function. How does it work? What is it actually doing? When it shuts down towards death, what is it shutting down and why? So it's a very fascinating subject, and we'll start getting into it, but it's important to note that even the, quote-unquote experts of today agree that it's not an exact science in the sense that we don't know everything there is to know about the brain and how it works. Phrenology is real. So, let's talk a little bit about the structure, and we'll start from the very, very beginning. Oh, is that just Cherry who can't hear? Welcome, Cherry, and thank you for joining. I think you might need to... Actually, I'm talking and she can't hear me, so maybe Rondon will will update her in chat. So, within the structure of the brain, obviously, it's sort of layers and layers of different levels that we could look at. And we're going to start from the smallest individual particle, let's say, of the brain, which is the neuron. And the actual neuron itself is a cell, and it's called a brain cell because it was thought at one time that they were only in the brain. We've since discovered neurons in heart and the gut, but nevertheless, the brain cell has a very distinct shape, size, and in relation to other cells in the body, it's very different. So the two most important parts that we'll be talking about are called the axon and the dendrite. And I do try to use the proper names so that if you want to look up anything afterwards, you'll be able to have an easier time. So that's actually three parts. There's the axon, the actual cell body, the nucleus, and the dendrite. Now, we should have actually said that the opposite. The dendrites are so called because they are sort of branches of the neuron, and that's where there is like the input of information. And so these dendrites stretch out, and they receive certain impulses that we'll get into, and they deliver the information down to the cell nuclei, and inside there is a certain reaction that can be triggered, and that sends an electrical impulse down the axon. And in a chain of neurons, this will lead to the dendrites of a new neuron that are linked to this neural network. So that's very, very quickly the basic structure and how it works. You have dendrites receiving information. They convey this information and pass it on to the actual body of the neuron. And when that triggers a response, it fires the neuron, what's known as firing, and that sends an electrical impulse down the axon. Now, there's one other important part in this equation, and that is the information that's being conveyed. The information that the dendrites receive is the same information that the axon sends on and at the tip of the axon. And these are known as neurotransmitters. Now, whether you've heard the term neurotransmitter or not, you've probably heard of examples of these. Some of the more recent ones have been sort of dopamine and serotonin, which a lot of the psychopharmacology has been focused on. But indeed, adrenaline and noradrenaline, these are all different neurotransmitters. Now, what neurotransmitters really are basically chemicals which are stored at the end of the axon. And so when an electrical impulse travels down the axon, it triggers this tip where the neurotransmitters are stored, and that releases them into the bloodstream. And if there's a connection with another neuron there, a synaptic connection, then those neurotransmitters trigger a response in the receiving dendrite, in the receiving end, and that will continue the chain. Now, why are we going into all of this, and what does it all have to do with anything? In this very, well, I don't know if simple, but at least relative to certain things and how they work, in this structure, there is a very interesting, I think, new kind of theory. And this is what I want to expound on just very quickly. If we recall of the different subjects that we've been going on. Oh, wonderful, Cherry. Well, I hope that's how you pronounce your word. Thank you very much for joining, and I'm glad we managed to sort it out. So, welcome. One of the subjects that we mentioned was the yin and yang, and specifically the binary, the mathematical sequence, as it were. For those who don't recall, the binary sequence is the same sequence that's used in the computer world, which is 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, the doubling of the previous number. This is also this mathematical series that biological life follows when it is splitting cells. Every cell is divided, and therefore the increase in the number of cells is binary. Now, with modern day computers as well, everything is still run on this very, very simple mathematical sequence, and it's actually a mathematical system. In no way can we say that this is not a useful system for us to have. Indeed, my very favorite game of Go is based on this system as well. And however, years and years ago, I was listening to a lecture and someone was talking about the brain as a computer, and it triggered inside of me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a while of thinking about the subject and researching it more until I realized the brain is actually very, very different from the computer in one very specific way. And so we spoke about axons and dendrites. When the professional language says that a neuron can either be firing or not firing. It either has an on state or an off state, which is binary. That means that the axon will stay, not firing as long as there is no signal. And as soon as the signal comes, it fires, and then it resets. This is pretty much, or very, very close to how the world of computers works. Now, the big difference is in the other half of that equation. And what happens is that we only have one axon that exits, but attached to the cell nucleus, there are many, many different dendrites. There can be thousands of dendrites that are connected to this one single neuron. And all of those dendrites are communicating with the neurotransmitters that we mentioned. So although the axon is firing in an on or off state, although the axon is clearly binary, the dendrites, the neurotransmitters, are actually not a binary system. And for lack of a better word, I coined it at the time as not just a computer, but an electrochemical computer. And this is, I think, a big part of what makes the brain such an incredible invention, as it were, of biology. Not even just the human brain, but the brain in general itself. This method of working seems to have broken out of the rigidity of the binary system while still being able to utilize its effectiveness. So what we have in the brain is a dual system that is working constantly together on the cellular level, nonetheless, where chemical impulses are being received by the dendrites. And these chemical impulses aren't exact. They're sort of messy, and it can get, hundreds or thousands of impulses in every second. And each of these impulses is sort of swaying the pendulum between firing and not firing. The way it actually does this is by an increase in in electrons within the actual cell body. And so there's a certain level of there's a positive charge, and it's in its resting state, and every neurotransmitter can affect this by adding or decreasing electrons. And at a certain point there's a threshold that's crossed, and this decides based on the electrical charge whether it's negative or positive to fire the axon. You don't have to understand all of that. I just felt it's necessary to at least once explain the whole process, so now you know a little bit about neurons and how they function. But in that sort of mechanism, in that system, we have a clear presentation of these two very distinct and very almost polar opposite systems, the binary and the chemical, which could be translated to a lot of these different polar ways of seeing things, the exact, the scientific, the left hemisphere, versus the intuitive, the dream world, the emotional, etc., etc. We have that built into the very design of the brain with these neurons. So that was just a small thought that I wanted to share, but it's important, if we've actually mentioned it already. Drunvalo Melchizedek talks a lot about brain structure, and one of the main focuses of his is the division of the two hemispheres. So if we'll leave the micro view of each cell and the structure and the neural network that it creates, we can actually zoom out and see the brain as divided into many different parts. And the first clear division that we see is the division into two hemispheres, conveniently called the left and right hemisphere. Now, a lot has been said about the different hemispheres over the years, and there is a lot of I think, not always a complete agreement among everyone as to their different functions. The main problem, I think, with studying the brain in general is its plasticity, meaning its ability to change. The brain is probably one of the most changeable, adaptive organs that we have, that we've come to see. And because of this, if there is in any way a malfunction, some kind of injury, something that impedes the brain doing something, it has this tremendous ability to compensate and use different parts that aren't meant to be used for that in order to achieve something. I'll just give a few very small examples, but there's a very famous, there was a documentary, I think he's actually passed away, but about a young kid who had a disease, I can't remember what it was, but among other things he was blind, and he had managed to develop echolocation, meaning he would make these clicking sounds with his voice, and he could hear through the clicking sounds and quote unquote see what was around him. There's a few people who can actually do this, but that's clearly a situation where the brain is utilizing a different part, a part of our brain structure that wasn't meant for echolocation. We have very advanced eyes, but it developed the ability to do that. And again, he wasn't taught to do this. It can, he discovered, as it were, it was the brain's own ability to adapt, which is really quite impressive. Reconfigure its programming in 30 days. What, for the brain? I'm not sure I understand. Thank you for joining, Deresko. I think I didn't see when you were in chat. Yes, Patient Zero, as always, to the rescue. Yeah, very interesting. Is this a full video? I can't actually see, I'm sorry. But check it out if you want. It's just, I was blown away. But there are many, many examples of the brain, doing unbelievable and certainly unexpected things. But following all of that, there is a certain amount that we can say about the brain, and there is a certain, quote-unquote, normalcy that many people share. And one of the useful divisions that we can see in the brain is this division into hemispheres. So generally speaking, if we were going to put it as plainly and clearly as possible, we'll actually use Drunvalo's language. Now, I think I mentioned this before, but it bears mentioning again, definitely. I use the words masculine and feminine. These words have almost nothing to do with men and women or any other gender-specific or non-specific term, neither in humans nor in animals. Masculine and feminine are the words that I use to describe forces in nature. very much akin to yin and yang, only for certain subjects I prefer this. I'm not even sure why, I'll have to think about it. But when I say something is masculine, that means to say it's the force of nature that is most easily recognized with the yang side of things, motion as opposed to stillness, chaos as opposed to order, innovation as opposed to stability, etc., etc., etc. That's what I mean by masculine and feminine, and that will, I hope, clear up any misunderstandings that could be made. So, generally speaking, in the words of Drunvil Melchizedek, the right hemisphere is the feminine, and the left hemisphere is the masculine. Now, on top of masculine and feminine, what we said, there are actual physical skills, as it were, that seem to be divided between these hemispheres. Maths and language seem to be centered and focused on in the left hemisphere, and creativity or art, these sort of things, the different arts, etc., seem to be more in the right hemisphere. However, I should point out, not music. It seems that in order to play music, it actually requires the use of both hemispheres, interestingly enough. So, the division of hemispheres, very much like the division of yin and yang, can sort of help us in understanding ourselves, understanding how the brain works, and how we can best utilize it for our needs. So, one of the very interesting things, I think, that can be said about the hemispheres, and I'll have to be honest, I actually learnt about this first from an episode of House. If any of you remember that series from long ago, I was a huge addict. I loved watching it, and in one of the episodes, they have a patient who suffers from... Actually, they weren't suffering from... I can't remember the name, I'm sorry, epilepsy, but it was a different disease where they lost control of one of the hemispheres. I can't remember what the disease was, but this patient's symptoms were that they didn't have full control of half of their body, meaning their conscious self only controlled the right side of their body, and the subconscious part of themselves, as it were, controlled the left side. Now, just to confuse things even more, for those who don't know, since we're talking about the brain basically starts at the head, as we know, and then travels down the spine. That's all part of the brain. It's very, very long axons that reach to all of the muscles. So the brain itself actually has an interesting thing where in the back of our neck, the neurons cross. And so within our body, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, my right hand, my right leg, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So that's just the way it is. But anyway, with this person, their left hemisphere, the part that's in charge of talking and generally considered more the conscious part because it's in charge of language, was controlling only the right side of the body. And in order to solve this, the proposition was that they would sever the two hemispheres, which actually sounds a lot worse than it seems to be. I wouldn't in any way recommend this without a reason, but for most of us, I assumed that if you cut the two hemispheres apart right down the middle, then that wouldn't be good. At best it would be like a lobotomy, and at worst they wouldn't survive. But it's a rather, relatively common procedure for patients with epilepsy who aren't responsive to drugs, to medication, and who have, really debilitating levels of attacks. There's a relatively common procedure where they cut it's called the corpus callosum, the big band of nerves that connects the two hemispheres. And following this, it actually works, because most of the debilitating effects of an epilepsy attack is when the attack spreads throughout the whole brain, throughout both hemispheres. And this way it sort of breaks the chain and allows it to dissipate more easily. They're very, very little that I understand it, I have to say. I shouldn't be talking about it. But for our purpose, in this episode, they showcased one of the things that can happen when one side of the body isn't communicating with the other. And that is, I think I remembered actually, the fact is that the disease, he had this surgery done where they separated his hemispheres, and now he had lost control of the side of the body. I think that's it. Anyway, they brought him in for a test. And in this test, he had 2 screens on either side of him. One screen he could only see with his right eye, and the other screen only with his left. And so in this way, they could communicate with only one hemisphere at a time. And so at one of the screens, they showed the words, stand up, or I can't remember what it was. And in the other one, they showed some kind of command. I think it was to draw some picture. And it was very interesting to see that there was a clear disconnect between the 2 hemispheres. So the patient, didn't know what was written on that other board when he was asked. But when he was actually given a command to draw, which is not using language, which is a part that the subconscious, the right hemisphere, can do, his left hand could actually draw the picture without his conscious self being aware of it. So it's a very interesting presentation of just how the brain works and just how the hemispheres interact. But all of this is to say that when a normal and healthy brain is functioning, obviously the 2 hemispheres are in complete sync and unison. Now, for our case, when Drunvalo Melchizedek is mentioning the 2 hemispheres, what we're really talking about is the 2 parts of ourselves, the masculine and feminine, that each of us have at different, balances and imbalances. And the idea is to allow each part of ourselves to be expressed fully and not at the expense of other parts. Excuse me. So, let's see what time it is. Okay, we're about at the halfway point. Let me just have a look at chat and see that I didn't miss anything. Alien hand syndrome. I think, yeah. Is that the name? When people with 7, I'll have to look that up, but I think so. Derisco, this is what you said. 30 days challenge to change a habit. NASA did an experiment with astronauts, making them wear glasses with concave lenses that flip the image of the world upside down to see how they... Yes. Yeah. There's actually also a bicycle that when you turn it left, it goes right and vice versa. And they said 30 days? No, I think it's a lot less now with the eyes, from what I heard. For the eyes to actually flip if you wear the glasses all the time, this is the idea that as I said, as it was written, if you wear the glasses and they show the world upside down, then after however long it is, you start seeing the right way up, and it goes back to normal. And if you take off the glasses, then you see upside down again and you have to revert back. This is also partly because, but our eye actually receives the picture upside down. It's flipped. And then our brain has to sort of flip it back in order to make sense. Our brain does a lot of image correction to what it actually gets as information before it builds the image that we see, which is why we witness so many imperfections, mistakes, and really fiction in the world that we view around us. In fact, if we're talking about the brain, I'm going to muddle up these statistics. I apologize. Please go and check them out afterwards and correct me. But from what I remember, basically, we receive, I think it was about 100 billion bits of information every second, and then our brain processes, however much it is, I can't remember, but like a 10% of that, and of the processed information, only 10% gets through. And then of that, only a very small fraction actually reaches our conscious self. So most of the information that we're experiencing and that we're receiving is being directly funneled, as it were, to our subconscious. And in fact, this is a good segue into the next subject that I wanted to talk about. So we've talked a little bit about the 2 hemispheres. Now, Drunvalo talks a lot about the hemispheres because a lot of his work was really focusing on both hemispheres and making sure that each one is with itself. He was actually a physics major until it was a long time, but he was almost graduating. I think he had a few courses and a few months left, and he decided to quit, and he studied history of art. And for him, these really were sort of the two hemispheres, each getting their own thing. And it's in his words, this decision that he made, which didn't make any sense at the time to his physics professors, was crucial for him to be able to understand the things that he then experienced. Now, indeed, in Egypt, there were, I think we mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, when we were talking about Sitchin in one of the episodes, they had two secret societies, not societies, but like teachings, as it were. The Horus's eye, the left eye path and the right eye, and each of these were actually each of the two hemispheres. And so a person who wanted to study the secret mystical religion had to spend 12 years studying in the left eye school, and then 12 years studying in the right, and only after 24 years did they complete the process that they needed. So this idea of balancing the two hemispheres, of really putting our energy into each of these distinct masculine and feminine, as it were, areas, is very, very important in the spiritual path, in my mind, as well as in Drupalo's. So I can see in chat there's a few things. Let me have a look. Why does the brain bother to flip the image? I'm not 100% sure. From what I understand, the image is flipped by the structure of the eye. This is like in anything with cameras as well. Once light is, as it were, refracted or passes through, the image is flipped. And then in order for the brain to sort of make sense of the world, it has to flip it back so that it matches what it saw, as it were. Yes, and about 10 ideas or thoughts cycle in. That's why when we are stressed, we think about the same stuff over and over again until we find a solution. Yes, in fact, we're going to talk about that as well. If we can cope with upside-down imagery, surely it's not necessary. Yes, no, it's not the brain's... this is the way the brain deals with lights. Very confusing, decision to be upside down. It's the same with cameras. If you do that sort of peek hole in a very, very dark room and it shows the image, then it's upside down as well. Never mind. That video, yes. Thank you, Patient Zero. It's really incredible. So, okay, I think we're caught up, and if there's anything else, I will have a look. But there's a little bit more that I want to get through, and I think we're actually going to make it perfect. So we've spoken about the two hemispheres, and we are going to talk about it more later in the series, but for now we can move on to the next division of the brain. And this is once more a sort of lower level, as it were. So we divided the brain into two, and now there are many, many divisions. There's the division into lobes, where each hemisphere has 4 lobes, and each hemisphere in terms of structure is almost parallel to the other. The brain is almost symmetrical. But we're actually going to talk about something else which some of you may have heard of indeed. The different brains, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and what we should call the human brain, but is actually called the Neo-cortex, as it were, the new brain. So what are these different parts? If you've never heard any of these terms, then that's quite all right. We're going to be talking about them probably very differently even than if you have. But these 3 brains are a division that's made in science, and they sort of correlate to the different functions of the brain. So the reptilian brain, so called because we share it with reptilians, is the oldest brain in an evolutionary sense. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible basically for keeping us alive. So all of the automatic functions, the beating of the heart and all of the different subconscious processes that our bodies have to do at every instant is controlled and regulated by the reptilian brain. So this is the brain that's also in charge of the instincts and the immediate responses to threats, especially. So all of these functions that really are very much on a survival level and therefore had to be the oldest are called the reptilian brain. And if you look at the brain, you can see that really the bottommost part, close to the spinal column is where the reptilian brain is. Now, above that, as it were, growing from that, the next in evolutionary term is called the mammalian brain. And the mammalian brain is everything that has to do with our emotions, as it were, which really are, part of these neurotransmitters and the different chemicals, the biochemistry that goes into our brain. One of the very important organs in the mammalian brain is the amygdala. And if I'm not mistaken, Cherry, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, Cherry, I'm not sure. But you mentioned the thought cycle, that when we get anxiety or even depression or many other situations, we get into this sort of loop. That loop is often tied into the amygdala. And we're going to see very soon what that actually means and how that happens. And then above all of this, as it were, the outermost layer of the brain, which when I was studying this, I didn't quite see a picture of it until much longer. I'd heard of these terms a lot earlier in books and in lectures. They're very famous. And I always imagined, the reptilian, and then the mammalian, and then the neo-cortex, the part that makes us human, this part that's, responsible for all of these things. But it's actually this sort of very relatively, thin layer on the outside of this very, very dense white and grey matter, as it were. And this thank you, yes, who is patient zero, obviously. Yes, thank you very much for uploading. So for those in chat, you have a picture. You know what, I'm going to try and get this up for those in chat as well. Sorry, I can't do this in a moment. Basically, the neocortex is the part that's in charge for our thinking self. Everything that we know as humans, that we regard as our conscious self, the part that's talking, etc., is in this neocortex. So that's basically the division of the different brains. Now, this division is useful for many reasons, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But first, to go back to what we were talking about with stress. What happens today? Well, what used to happen is that we were, gathering food, and there would be a lion, and within moments the lion will be upon us, so we have to react very, very quickly. So as soon as we recognize that there is an immediate threat, our body goes into survival mode, and all of the body's responses are geared to us physically running away from this threat, or going and attacking it if it's a reasonable threat to attack. This is the process that evolution has come up with in order to deal with survival and the constant threats. However, evolution hasn't had time to adjust to our lifestyle, mainly because it's only been around for a couple of 100 years, really. And so we are left with a very misguided system. So firstly, we have a system that's responsible for searching and identifying threats. And if you remember from last week's episode, I believe, alpha waves and an alpha state is usually when we're on high alert and when we're not relaxed at all, but we're actually, on survival mode in one way or another. So an example of this would be if we're nervous, if we're about to go into a job interview, or if we're, being reprimanded for something, or whatever it is that sends us into this state, in terms of the body's interpretation of what's happening, this is akin to us being faced with some kind of threat. Now, at this point, obviously, all of these responses are very, very physical, and they're meant to aid us in our physical fight. The problem is that our situation doesn't require, or some of these situations don't actually require a physical fight. And so we're left with this system in overload that isn't doing what it's supposed to do because it's not what we need right now. Now, when a message gets into the subconscious that is a threat, it immediately triggers the mammalian brain. So along with the increased heart rate and shallow breaths and, increased blood pressure and all of these things, it's actually triggering responses in the mammalian brain, which we've mentioned the amygdala as being a crucial part. This is the part that's in charge of our emotions, as it were. And so the amygdala is where we feel, threatened, afraid, sad, etc. And so this system has triggered the amygdala, telling us we are afraid, there is a threat. And only then does this signal actually reach our conscious brain. So this is all happening in that very, very short split second where, we see someone coming towards us or whatever it is. These are all the processes that are taking place in the milliseconds before we even realize something is happening. So by the time it's reached us, it's already in this engaged state. And if we are, let's say children, for example, who have less self-control, their conscious mind will immediately, as it were, jump on the bandwagon, feel all of these emotions, take this situation seriously, and usually end up crying. Why is it that the child will cry if something is very, very small? Because of this whole system that's in place that's telling, the brain is telling the conscious part of it, there is a danger, there is a problem, we have to react. As it were, for a child, the reaction often will be crying as a survival mechanism, or indeed punching someone in the face. But that is part of the system that is set up. It's a very, very basic, oversimplified description of everything that happens. But for our case, when we look at anxiety, we see the exact same thing happening. We see the amygdala being activated and triggering an emotional response, and our thoughts being fed by that emotional response, by that feeling. So I am nervous about something. And what's interesting about the brain and about the conscious part is that it's tasked with making sense of the world. And it will do this to a fault, meaning if it doesn't know how to make sense, and let's face it, often we don't, it will make up and test that theory, to see if it's true. But until it tests it, it will still believe the theory to be true. So what I mean by this, because that might be a little bit out there, in fact, if you go back and watch the episode of House, there is a part where they command the subconscious part of his brain to stand up. And so the patient stands up. And then they ask him why he stood up. And he says, he looks around and then he says, because I was cold. I wanted to just get a sweater very quickly. Now, what he did there was he invented a story that isn't true, but makes perfect sense to explain the behavior that he couldn't explain. And this is what the brain does with anxiety. We have a situation. I feel one way. Now I'm feeling anxious. Now all I have to do is find something to feel anxious about. And let's face it, that's not much of a problem. Now, I realize that this might sound like I'm saying any anxiety is actually fake and not based on something. That isn't true. Obviously, there are things that make us anxious, but I'm trying to explain the way that this system works. We have a very strong emotional subconscious impulse that is activated long before we have any conscious thoughts of why am I like this, or what am I feeling about this, or what am I, why am I anxious? This whole system is in place long before, and I think part of our goal in my mind is to be able to allow our neo-cortex, our conscious part that's, evolved the latest, but certainly plays a very important role in our life, to be able to look at the situation objectively and say, okay, is there a madman with an axe running towards me? Then absolutely, this is a perfect time to run. All of the systems go. But if there is a test in high school tomorrow and I want to succeed and I don't want to fail, then that anxiety isn't actually the answer, and indeed it could make us it can impede our function, because what we need is to be able to think, and all the systems that are working are indeed for physical activity. And so with all of these words, I think we've tiptoed long enough around the final subject that we're going to tackle in this week's episode, and that is, how does this division correlate to what we've been speaking about? And so many episodes ago, no, just a few, we spoke about the 4 elements, and we mentioned them in relation to the 4 parts of our psyche, our being, ourselves. And those were, for those who don't remember, the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual. Now, we're not going to get into discussion about the 4. Obviously, there's a lot to be said, but, well, the first problem, we have 4 divisions here and 3 parts of the brain. Now, with the spiritual part, we're going to tackle that in a moment. Maybe maybe I've left it a bit late, but let's start with the first 3 and we'll advance from there. In my mind, it's very clear that the reptilian brain represents our physical body because it is almost completely limited to that. It is the basic survival of what a biological organism needs in order to survive and in order to thrive. And so we can correlate the physical very easily to the reptilian brain. Now, this also plays in very nicely to what we know about things that are said about reptilians, that they are cold-blooded, emotionless, all of these things really relate to not yet evolved emotions. This is obviously part of the mammalian brain, where the mammalian brain relates to the emotional side, and we can see often in mammals what we anthropomorphize as being some kind of emotion. There are dog psychiatrists and psychologists and animal whisperers are very certain. No, but seriously, I think if anyone's had a pet and grown with a pet, you can see that they have moods and they have emotions. They can be sad, they can be happy, they can be blissful, they can be, depressed or whatever. But not to get into any kind of discussion, I think we can see that there is something in mammals that has evolved, and this is not just emotions. This isn't just us feeling happy or sad. This really is a system of information and communication that allows a more complex system of governing different organisms to come forward. The idea of a herd or the idea of a pack is something that's only possible when you can cooperate with your own species to this level, which is something that seems to have been unlocked with the emotional side, with the mammalian development of the brain. Wow, many words. And lastly, of course, the Neo-cortex. This is literally where we do our thinking, and so it makes sense that we would call this or correlate this part to the mental side. Now, I'll just very quickly mention my thoughts. Oh, hang on, I see I've got a question here. Engine Witty, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. I think it's first time. So, welcome. Okay, would you say that a lot of the triggers have been conditioned by society, seeing the anxiety as out of place in some cases? Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is not the place, and I've mentioned it very quickly before, but fear and anxiety are very, very powerful tools for controlling people, and it's because of this whole system. In fact, the mammalian brain is also what's in charge of loyalty, and indeed sort of what we know as patriotism and nationalism, which I think is quite clearly shown that in history these ideas have been used in order to gain control in nefarious ways. It's clear that the number one tool that was used and is still being used for controlling large populations, and literally controlling, not just organizing, but controlling, is definitely the fear, and not just fear of immediate threats, but the general state of fear. The reason for this is actually relates to what we've been talking about, and if I dare say, we can relate it to the chakra system. So in the chakra system, it's a system of 7, and here we have 3 and 4, but more or less we could correlate the first chakra, the root chakra, as being related to the physical side. And as we go up, they sort of move on this spectrum, the heart chakra being the center of the emotional side, again, the mammalian brain, and then moving up towards the higher chakras from more or less the throat, which is connected to language, which is considered the first of the mental chakras. So what we talk about, what from a chakra energetic level, when we say someone is being controlled by their fears, what is being done to them is that there is an accentuation of the lower chakras, of the root chakra. This means of the thoughts about survival and being constantly afraid for one's own well-being. This in turn limits the other chakras. And so on a very clear sort of basic level, we can see this when we say that someone, in order to be a philosopher, you need a lot of, comfort. People who don't have enough to eat don't become philosophers. Before you can get to that level of thinking, you need your basic needs met. And so if you keep people, doesn't matter if it's economic or indeed, terror, or any strong emotional fear that threatens their very survival, meaning that threatens their reptilian brain, their physical being, then this will ensure that they will stay locked into that reptilian consciousness of fight or flight, and that consciousness doesn't allow for too much, considering the situation. If you're thinking about an uprising or changing things, etc., it's a very clear way for you to keep a populace obedient. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I think if people understood the way that their brains function, this is really part of the reason I said I decided to talk about this, it could really help us gain control of our consciousness. Nothing more. I mean, first, let's have each person in charge and in control of their consciousness, meaning that simply statements on the news, billboards, or any kind of easily manipulated external sources won't have such a strong effect on people. That would be a very, very powerful move. There is freeze. I always thought about that. Yeah, why? Either fight or flight. Where is this in the evolutionary species? A lot of animals, a lot of species do that. Lots of reptiles. Yes, but I think it's a very, very crucial part, and I think that for people in general, obviously not my listeners because you're all highly evolved and enlightened people, but the majority of the other people, there is a very quick sort of giving up of independent thought, of independent research, of intuition even, of trusting your instincts. This very basic concept of, do I know what's good for me? And this in part is the herd mentality. If you've been here from the beginning, you'll remember the episodes on Sitchin on various reasons for why humans behave this way. But regardless of any of that, we definitely see a tendency of humans in general to look for a strong leader that will decide for them how they feel or how they should feel. And if we, as human beings with a brain each capable of free thinking, if we realize that we are so easily manipulated into the fight or flight, into anxiety, into depression, that we need, sometimes medication or whatever, if we realize that this is the situation, it becomes much more possible for our conscious self to step up, for our consciousness to actually witness what is happening as it's happening, witness our emotional side taking control or getting out of control, and actually be able to take back and to think more clearly. And this is something that we've been doing since day one. This is something that we're all capable of. As soon as you learn society's rules and agree to them and adhere to them over your own personal well-being and thoughts, you are training your brain with your conscious part. You are training the impulses, the mammalian brain to, to be under control to a certain degree. And the more we do it, the more adult, quote unquote, we become. Now, we won't go into the problems of imbalances for the other way. Obviously, any imbalance is a bad thing. We are striving for balance of everything. But nevertheless, I think that a lot of people today feel that they don't know what's real if they're not told. And this is a real shame. Okay. So true, I may not know instinctually what's good for me, but I trust my instinct on what is not good for me. Excellent. And I think that instincts, well, for me personally in my life, instincts are, quote unquote, a muscle. I went through a long journey because I never trusted my instincts in the beginning, or not actually instincts, I should say intuition, because instincts are slightly different, but I never listened to that voice. I was actually the opposite. I was much more rational, and I always tried, or I should say I didn't notice my emotional side. But it took me a long time to start to trust myself, to start to trust my senses, trust my judgment, and really, actually dare to step up to it, because it's tough. It really is frightening. I mean, I have no criticism of people, because I understand why we're all like this, and it's very, very frightening to watch killings or mass shootings or any kind of threatening activity that is awful, and to, you know, stand up to it and say whatever it is that you say, from not letting it govern you to I don't believe it's real. It's tough. It's tough to do that. But I do think that it's important for us to focus very much on our environment and focus very much on ourselves. In the end, ultimately, it's not even our brain. It's not even my brain. It is the me that is talking. It is myself. So speaking about it in the third person is quite confusing. But we, I think, should learn more about how our brain functions and how we can utilize it best. And that was sort of what I was trying to go for in this episode. And I think I actually hope to go for a little bit more of a correlation, but maybe we'll carry on next week. What we were speaking about last week, the law of harmonies, and in general astrology and the chakra system, all of these are obviously very, very closely tied to the brain's function. And indeed, the very big part which correlates and communicates between the brain and these, you know, more energetic sides is the right hemisphere and the, shall we say, the chemical part of the electrochemical system. So that was just a few thoughts. Okay, the whole world tries to convince us we know nothing and can't trust our intuition and our instincts. Yes, this is, I think, the best word that I know is infantilization, which means making people behave and act like infants. And this has been going on for a long, long time, because the whole idea of expertise, or really with the industrial age training people to become quote-unquote professional, means narrowing their field of profession, their field of ability to a very, very narrow one. And with that, you cut off the person's ability to do anything else or think about it. Why? Because I have my subject that I'm a professional in, and I know everything there is to know, and that's, you know, my responsibility. But beyond that, outside of that, I don't have the tools because I'm not the professional. So I turn to a professional for every other area in my life, whether it's my physical health, you know, my mental health, you know, my art, my whatever it is, everything else I need to use other people in order to get. And that has led us to a point where people don't trust or even aren't connected to what they feel about things. And really, I think, as we can see in the world today, a lot of people feel very, very lost and feel that they used to have all of the answers until very, very recently, and now suddenly all the people who are giving them answers seem to not know what's going on either. And that's sending us into a panic of, well, these were the guys who were supposed to take care of us. If they're not taking care of us, then who is? I sure as hell isn't. Which brings us back to the problem. So if I could leave you all with some final words, it would be, first, thank you very, very much for joining. Oh, wow, a lot of people in chat. I'm sorry I didn't welcome all of you, but it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. We have another show afterwards, I think, Rondon, I'm pretty sure. As it is, I've been Orlev. This has been the Discomfort Zone podcast. And remember, you are in complete control of your consciousness, your being, your body, and it really is up to us to decide who we want to be and how. So, excellent. Next up, post up. Wonderful. I keep forgetting. I'm so sorry. So thank you very much for joining. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope I will see you all next week. Until then, have a good one.